3 kinds of mimesis and 2 projects. Yes. And by the way, before I begin, I wanted to make sure that you're all acquainted with my friend Henri, who has accompanied me to all these conferences and who was basically my mentor, the hedgehog, and he keeps me thinking about the one big thing that hedgehogs are known for, which is, of course, the origin of the human and of language. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yep, just good.
Oh, good, okay. We're all familiar with John Searle's Chinese room, in which a human follows instructions that allow him to copy out answers to questions in Chinese, although I hope not in Chinese characters, without understanding the language. Well, fine, but if the answers are correct, the human computer clone doesn't have to understand anything. If his or its algorithms produce the correct answer, then it has passed the Turing test and demonstrated its functional equivalence to the human mind in performing this task. As the years go by, computer simulations become increasingly more capable of improving on the human nervous system. At one time, they were learning to play chess. Then they beat the best humans at chess, but not at Go, whose much larger board is not set up in advance, but where each move is dictated by a global strategy. Then a couple of years ago, a Go program was able to defeat the world's best players. Whatever our understanding of the human soul, I think we can stipulate as self-evident that it would be foolhardy to attempt to demonstrate at this early stage in the history of AI that any human behavior could not be algorithmically stimulated. The more profound questions posed by AI lie elsewhere. As I have been claiming for the past 40 years, human language emerged in the first place in order to defer the mimetic violence that threatened the proto-human community. Our cruel metaphysical language of declarative propositions and truth values must have been preceded by signs of designation or pointing, an originary ostensive. This was not a product of disinterested contemplation. On the contrary, our capacity for such contemplation is the result of a sacred imperative to defer the reflexive appropriation of a common object of desire. Thus, I consider a humanistic anthropology to be one that refuses to reduce the specifically human to the biological, that is, and that recognizes human uniqueness by tacitly or explicitly accepting the originary equation of the sacred with the significant, of the human self with a conscience or soul. What can such anthropological reflection suggest about AI's potential for exploring the human world? I will leave aside its obvious uses in industry and science, nor will I deal with the sci-fi nightmare scenarios in which our creations revolt against their human masters. We are already sufficiently dangerous to ourselves. Yet the Frankensteinian dream need not for all that be abandoned, perhaps. AI is most simply understood as a mode of cybernetic simulation or mimesis created by humans whose own mimetic capacity must itself be understood as a qualitative improvement on the biological mimesis that had evolved in plants and animals through natural selection. This suggests that we should examine mimesis on 3 levels. In the first place, there is biological mimesis, butterflies that imitate natural backgrounds, predators whose tongues imitate worms, or even plants that imitate sources of pollen in order to devour the insects they attract. And needless to say, higher mammals have evolved much more flexible nervous systems that enable them to learn through imitation, various techniques, calls, and so on, or even to engage in ritualized mimetic conflict, as when stags fight over a doe. What then is it in human mimesis that cannot be understood in wholly biological terms? I need not persuade this group that the kernel of René Girard's thought was his insight into human mimesis, whence the term mimetic theory applied to the ensemble of his work. His first and still most evocative analysis of mimesis is found in his 1961 study of the European novel, Mensonges romantiques et vérités romanesques. And the key not only to that book's great influence, but to Girard's entire intellectual career, is its still largely implicit mimetic anthropology, to be revealed more fully in 1972 with La violence et le sacré, and in its definitive Christian form in the 1978 Des choses cachées depuis la fondation du monde, after the publication of which Girard said to me, "Maintenant je peux mourir, now I can die." In other words, I've published all I need to publish to ensure that my ideas will survive. Girard's anthropology, as we all know, emphasizes the qualitatively greater danger of human mimetic conflict than that within animal species, hence the need for new means to control it. The key to humanity's superior mimetic intelligence lies paradoxically in our sharing of a basic fact of animal biology, vulnerability to physical violence. All creatures have to be able to perpetuate themselves, and individuals must be able to survive long enough to procreate, even if this survival itself be brief. In the case of our immediate predecessors, apes with superior intelligence require a good deal of time to develop, and this means that the society within which they operate must be particularly peaceful and cooperative. Yet this situation leads to a pragmatic paradox. Given the benefits of higher levels of intelligence within a proto-human or hominin species in dealing with the stresses of its external environment, the increasing danger of intraspecific mimetic conflict imposes a limit on the capacity of biological evolution to continue to improve this intelligence. Whence the minimal, or my minimal, definition of the human as the species that has become a greater danger to its own survival than is the outside world, or shall we just say the species that has become its own worst enemy. The emergence of such a creature is a turning point in evolution and in the ontology of living beings. It is also the source of the paradoxes that plague humanity, the most fundamental of which is the constant tension between, well, love and resentment, good and evil, or in other terms, moral equality and firstness. Generative anthropology's originary hypothesis is a modification of the emissary murder that was La violence et le sacré's version of the scene of human origin. In contrast to the latter's emphasis on the discharge of violence, GA situates the origin of language, religion, and all of human culture in the deferral of violence, which has so far permitted us super apes to keep one step ahead of the growing potential of conflict inherent in our mimetic intelligence. I'm not sure how much longer this is going to last, but so far so good. GA's originary hypothesis assumes that growing mimetic tension has brought our proto-human ancestors to a point of transition at which the alpha-beta social order is breaking down, or the serial order of ape precedence. Not only will beta no longer defer to alpha, but the entire group no longer obeys the inhibition obliging each to accept the serial priority of first one and the next. After any number of violent encounters in which the food to be distributed, presumably a large animal scavenged or killed in the hunt, after a number of violent encounters in which the food itself may well become a casualty of human violence, an anticipatory sense arises within the group that this central object is too dangerous for individuals to seek to appropriate, too dangerous and also too precious. Such appropriation comes to appear interdicted by a sacred will, which protects the participants from their own potential violence while frustrating their individual appetites. Hence, what had begun as appropriative gestures come to be aborted, or to use Derrida's term, deferred, and these abortive gestures or appropriation come to be mutually recognized as instances of a common sign. In the simplest case, the act of pointing or shared joint attention, which only humans perform. a sign which they understand as expressing their mutual renunciation, as well as their mutual recognition of the centrality of this object. The sign's quasi-ritual repetition in what had become a sacred scene replaces rivalry with cooperation and subsequently leads to the division of the meat in an equal feast, using a Homeric term, such as those among Homeric heroes, Robertson Smith's famous camel sacrifice, or a traditional American Thanksgiving dinner. Thus, the transition from animal to human is presided over by a sense of sacred interdiction that defers mimetic rivalry, a deferral that transforms animal appetite into human desire, appetite mediated by this mutually signified interdiction. This anthropological etiology of the sacred is independent but not contradictory of a transcendental ontology that would attribute it to God as an independent object of faith. What we call our soul or conscience derives from this experience as a historical inheritance transmitted through the generations to each human individual. The conscience is experienced as functioning even in the absence of others, as if the sacred scene were always present within us as a reminder to obey its commands, even in the absence of external constraint. This scenario explains the paradoxical status of human desire. The product of the deferral of instinctive appetitive activity, it bears with it from the outset the temptation to reject the sacred interdiction, which, by explicitly forbidding action, adds its mediating force to the original appetitive stimulation, which is why so many of Girard's admirers have difficulty in conceiving good mimetic desire. Whether or not you were persuaded by this hypothesis, I can't imagine that any serious student of Girard's work would disagree with its premise that human language and culture cannot be understood without postulating a sense of the sacred of the kind I have described. Sacred interdiction is not a conditioned reflex, or Pavlovian sort of reflex. We feel compelled to defer our appetitive urge via a conscious mechanism that we specifically call our conscience, in which we willingly subject our decision to a higher will, the basis of the Freudian superego. This will is something that we sense within us, and at the same time as grounded beyond us, the trace of the originary deferral of appropriation, whether compelled by God or by our fear of and loyalty to the human community. To understand the essence of our being is ultimately determined by this will, is to understand this essence as a soul. This conception of the human soul is central to Girard's thinking as well as my own. Indeed, it is at the very core of his thinking, the point he makes at the end of Mensonge Romantique by quoting Alyosha Karamazov's words to his disciples, celebrating the triumph of Christian love. The book's lesson, as its epigraph from Max Scheler states, is that, quote, man possesses a god or an idol, unquote. Desire implies mediation, and we are mediated either by one or the other, whether by the real sacred or a worldly being falsely taken for one, God or Satan. What does cybernetic mimesis add to these categories? Let us recall Descartes' characterization of animals as machines. We can forget his denial to animals of consciousness, pain, and the like. But insofar as mimesis is concerned, and even if the higher apes possess mirror neurons, their lack of a scene of representation on which to reflect on the matter of consciousness, a reflection mediated by the scene's connection through language to the human community, allows us to understand pre-human mimesis as essentially mechanical, reflexive, but unreflective. The evolution of animal intelligence is driven by improved reproductive fitness and only marginally transmissible to future generations, rather than, like our own, by human society's cumulative cultural intentionality, or simply the fact that we have a history and that animals don't. And cybernetic mimesis can be understood as modeled not on human but on animal reflexive mimesis, although equipped with feedback mechanisms wholly disproportional to those permitted by biological processes. Computers defeat the best human players at games not by reflecting on board configurations, but by learning the best strategies through trial and error over trillions of iterations. Billions at least, but I think trillions. In contrast, the human soul is grounded in its belonging to the human community, whose shared representations inhabit us and make us willy-nilly members of this community. A child learning language is culturally inheriting this human belonging. And as wild children reveal, a child not provided this inheritance in its early years never becomes a fully functional human being. Cybernetic devices are not initiated into language by any such experiences. Language for them is merely a sequence of instructions. Even cyborgs with sensors that would provide the equivalence of pain and the 5 human senses would not acquire a soul unless we found a way to program them to simulate on their own our discovery of language and the sacred. What generative anthropology as a humanistic anthropology brings to the table in a discussion of AI is what I have called originary phenomenology. This is the use of our hypothetical worldly scene or scenario as a basis of reflection, one in which we can imagine ourselves sharing the reactions of the proto-humans who experience it. This is a feature shared with the less rigorous but far richer scenarios of the Bible and similar religious narratives, but not with the empirical sciences. Scientists cannot tolerate such hypothetical scenes, which they denounce as empirically unfalsifiable, to use Popper's term, although without them we are unable to conceive the specificity of the human soul. A phenomenology describes a scene of consciousness. We take scenes for granted, all the more for the past decade or so as we walk around all day long with portable electronic screens to display them. Thus, I have called our age the Scenic age, a neologism that hasn't exactly caught on, but I think it's of some use. Animals have fields of perception, but the scene is a specifically human phenomenon, something we realize when we attempt to get a pet to watch a movie, for instance, that ultimately derives from the originary event, the ancestor of all scenic phenomena, such as artistic performances and even online conferences. Cultural phenomena define their scene in advance and can serve as models for the AI equivalent. But the scenes of everyday life have to be defined ad hoc by their human participants, and in most circumstances, their boundaries are not set in advance. A scene is not merely a frame that includes all within it and excludes everything else. It is a locus of significance, where what happens impinges on our relationships with the human community and the sacred will that holds it together. Our love for fictions derives from the pleasure of immersing ourselves in a scene where the decisions have already been made for us, where the creator God simulated by the author is charged with ensuring its coherence. Unless, of course, he decides, as modernists often do, to make divine incoherence the very lesson of the scene. Thus, beyond matters of simple calculation or the mimetic symmetry of zero-sum games, the challenge for cybernetic mimesis is not simply to simulate the result of a given human judgment, but simulating its scenic basis, in which we appeal, as it were, to our sacred link to the human community in framing, that is, establishing the parameters of our decisions. It is only thus that we can call our choices moral, letting our conscience tell us what factors are relevant from the broadest human standpoint. These considerations suggest to me 2 very different AI projects. The first would be to use AI and its dependent devices as we do today, as machines that we program to solve increasingly complex worldly problems. Beyond its obvious industrial and military applications, I would suggest an AI project that might help save our civilization from its current self-destructive malaise as reflected in the increasingly pervasive woke social religion. What are these expressions of cultural self-hatred trying to tell us? Humanity's great ethical problem resides in the necessary contrast between, on the one hand, the symmetry of the originary scene and its ritual reproduction in our cultural forms, and on the other, the necessary firstness that is itself a product of this human symmetry. Each of us possesses his own human scene, a mental laboratory separated from the world by a Sartrean néant, on which we perform what are felicitously known as thought experiments. Lacking such a scene, animals can create little more than what they have been programmed to create. This is not, by the way, to deny that animal intelligence is more than just purely mechanical, but it can never really hold on to its creations because it doesn't have a way of communicating them through the medium of language, which brings together the human community. But in consequence, we must face the fact that although the originary event teaches us that we are all morally equivalent, in ethical terms, we have different talents in different degrees, and the advancement of society demands that these talents be maximally put to use at the risk of losing out to other social groups that use their talents more efficiently. Nor is there any obviously moral way of going about this. Although, as Steven Pinker does well to tell us, over the millennia, human equity as well as our quality of life has made vast amounts of progress. Like, living twice as long as the people a century ago, for example. However cruel or compassionate, the social manifestation of firstness conflicts with moral equality. This is a bottom line. I could give a whole talk about this because this is precisely what the wokeness rejects, and yet this is a sad truth, but it's a fact. You can't have a society where the social manifestation of firstness smoothly integrates with moral equality. There's always going to be a tension. The history of social organization, from the ancient empires based on slave labor through the feudal system and the advent of bourgeois society down to today, is one of clear moral progress. And I can go back to Pinker on this. Yet it has all too often been marked by various degrees, sometimes outrageous degrees, of immorality. Today, the liberal democratic West, which had all been persuaded by the downfall of the USSR a few decades ago, just remember 1989 and 91, that's only 30 years ago, that it had persuaded that it had attained the end of history as defined by conflict among political systems. We all remember, the famous end of history trope. Well, and which had, in addition, thought to have done away with discriminatory practices of all kinds, for instance, through the Civil Rights Act and so on. This same society has gone from overconfidence to despair, from a sense of achieved equality to one of systemic racism, and this despite the fact that it remains the unrivaled domain of choice for any potential migrants with a chance to make it their home. I don't think too many people are trying, getting in boats trying to get into China. This malaise must be understood as pointing to a problem of real significance. Today, it is difficult to conceive the credibility in post-World War II Western economies of Marx's labor theory of value. I say this as someone who was brought up during this period. In Marx's labor theory of value, it's physical labor was the standard. This was a middle-class era. I'm talking about, the 50s and so on. A middle-class era in which there was no clear-cut class distinction between skilled workers and professionals, or blue-collar and white-collar workers, as we called them in those days. Just not to say that everybody was making the same salary, but there was no sense that we belonged to entirely different societies. In sharp contrast, in today's digital societies, in which productive labor increasingly depends on sophisticated mathematical and/or linguistic symbol manipulation of the sort in which we are indulging in here, the need to measure individual aptitudes, that is, for a genuine meritocracy, is vastly increased over previous years. Under these circumstances, it is most unhelpful to blame racial privilege for any lack of success among the descendants of those who have suffered inequities in the past, and even more so to seek to compensate these past inequities by non-merit-based advantages. That woke ideas have spread without resistance among those most severely criticized by them, including virtually all our tech billionaires, demonstrates that wokeness reflects, above all, the anxieties generated by the increasingly competitive global economy among both insecure beginners and successful performers impatient to signal their virtue. While the winners are glad to denounce their privilege without renouncing it more than symbolically, as you will note, those still in the fight, most especially the young, find in the denunciation and partial undoing of meritocracy a repository for their fears of inadequacy. As you see by, I went to the Bronx High School of Science, you had to take a test to get in. I think that's still the case, but de Blasio is doing his best to eliminate that because it produces too many Asian students. But anyway, I'll do away with these ad libs here. What this situation appears to be telling us is that rather than abolishing merit-based requirements and opportunities, our society must generate new methods for bringing the less successful up to standard. This is especially crucial for those children who do not enjoy the benefits of supportive family life. Child rearing among the professional class has become much more competitive over my lifetime. When I was in kindergarten 75 years ago, by the Royal, I was the only child in a class of over 40 who could read. That's a fact. The teacher wrote the title of a book on the board, and I will always remember the title because I read it to the class and everybody was shocked that I could read. Today, among 40 of my classmates' great-grandchildren, I am certain that many, if not most, have begun learning to read. Did you hear a ping there?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
Oh, well, you can try to, sorry. So I say that today among 40 of my classmates' great-grandchildren, I'm certain that many, if not most, have begun learning to read. Whereas in a comparable group of working-class children, this is probably not the case. This is not exclusively a racial matter. Charles Murray's Coming Apart, which is a very interesting book, explicitly analyzes the severe new class divide between what he calls Fishtown, or the working class, and Belmont, or the professional neighborhood. But the comparison is wholly within white society because he wants to eliminate the racial question from this as a parameter. Thus, it seems to me that a crucial focus for AI research should be an effort in conjunction with cognitive science to stimulate and supplement human intelligence from a very early age, perhaps eventually using such techniques as cyber implants, in order to maximize the entire population's ability to handle the demands of a global society that will almost certainly remain increasingly dependent on symbol manipulation. We're not going to bring back the labor aristocracy of the 50s. My second AI project is more ambitious, but not, I believe, beyond human limitations. Its implementation would be of profound significance for the human self-understanding, that is the central purpose of anthropology as I conceive it. Given my claim that GA's originary hypothesis provides a plausible model of human origin, would the ultimate challenge to AI not be to test this hypothesis by simulating the worldly conditions of this origin? This would involve attempting to provoke the simultaneous discovery invention among a group of cyborgs driven by programmed instincts, including the capacity to arouse mimetic rivalry, of signs. After all, we started out without having signs. We invented them ourselves, or God provided them to us. And so we would put a bunch of cyborgs in the same hominin situation and see if they can invent their own language of signs. as a means of deferring violence. We would then attempt to determine in what sense this does or does not entail the concomitant emergence of a collective sacred, as well as the presence in each of these beings of something like a human conscience or soul. If, as might be expected, efforts to carry out such a task ended in failure, the lessons learned could not help but provide new insights into the basis of our own nature. The eventual discovery of an impossibility proof would, somewhat on the analogy of Gödel's proof of the incompleteness of arithmetic, tell us a great deal about the limits of algorithmic as opposed to biological or perhaps divinely inspired mimesis. In the contrary case of success, we would have realized the ultimate science fiction dream that we have cherished at least since Mary Shelley, the creation of beings with truly human-like rather than mechanical minds, with a language, a soul of their own, except that these minds would operate billions of times faster than ours. On second thought, then, maybe we would do better to just leave this one in the realm of science fiction. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So
that was a great talk, Eric, and we greatly appreciate it. I'm going to turn now to Professor Chris Fleming from the University of Western Sydney in Australia. Known, I'm sure, also to many of us, the author most recently of On Drugs and a number of other successful works, and professor of philosophy, I should say, and a member of the GA Society as well, for a response. Chris.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Eric. As I said, Eric, I've been asked to keep this response to around 5 minutes, but in fact, I've written a 1 hour response, but I've trained myself to deliver it in 5 minutes, which means that in just a moment, I'll be talking at approximately 2,000 words per minute, which is slightly slower than my typing speed, or around 33 words per second. Such an approach has restricted somewhat the length of the words I'll be able to use, but this should also aid in its comprehensibility. Alternatively, I could do this. Professor Gans has once again turned his superhuman brain to issues of enormous significance in a paper that seems to cover, by my estimate, a range of ideas which span somewhere between approximately 150,000 BCE and the year 40,000, or whenever those bots discover the aborted gesture, which is quite a lot. My greatest single frustration with the paper is that he's in fact able to do this, and with a parsimony and elan that quite frankly makes me angry. There are many points that Professor Gans raises throughout that I could do nothing but say amen or even alleluia, really the only vocabulary any pious person should ever need. But alas, I have no piety. So I'm going to use a few more than those 2 words. But of note, just quickly, of what really interested me in his presentation were about the continuities between animals and cybernetic mimesis, his very interesting scenarios simulating the origin of language, like Miller and Urey once tried to do in their lab with ammonia and methane, but here in the context of an AI environment, as well as some incredible framing about the continuities of generative and mimetic anthropology. Professor Gans is a great minimizer of differences sometimes. I think this is one of the strongest elements of GA, the minimality of the hypothesis itself, as well as the smaller distances one needs to cover between different ideas. And what's easy to miss, I think, in his paper is these links and these continuities, which have been spelled out before. Obviously, as Ian mentioned, the Girardian origins of generative anthropology. And we also get in the paper an amazing summary of generative anthropology itself. In any case, I have no axes to grind and little time left not to do it. So really what my task is going to be is to ask questions so that we can get some discussion happening. So some of these, I'm guessing, Eric would expect me to ask, having now known each other for 0.8 of a quarter of a century. That sounded somehow more exact than 20 years. And perhaps I'm driven by a series of mechanisms. And so I will put these, I'll offer three kinds of questions that I'd want to ask about this and see what possible responses there might be. So firstly, Professor Gans defines the human, I think it's also a Girardian idea, defines the human from one angle as, quote, the species that has become a greater danger to its own survival than is the outside world. Now, this seems to me to be an excellent anthropological either hypothesis or assumption, speculation, and is perhaps unquestionable in its context. And I think this is true if we conceive of the self in terms of the locus of this scene of representation, which is again I think a really an idea that's very difficult to gainsay. But I want to ask whether this definition of the human as a species that become a greater danger to its own survival than is the outside world is whether history has in fact changed this, maybe even destabilized this distinction that might seem to hold between us and the outside world. We are, of course, very unlikely to be wiped out by a dangerous gang of volcanoes, which we still only make and simulate in theme parks. But can the same distinction be said to exist in the case of acid rain, of rising sea temperatures, and of Fukushima, which are, of course, outside us or the outside world in some ways, but are also products of human ingenuity, the Anthropocene, whatever you want to, however you want to think of it. And of course, one has to accept certain ideas in climate science in order to get the argument running. But I think it's an important question, at least, to raise whether it is still the case that we are the only danger to ourselves, at least in terms of specific violence. So that's the first. So the second, there's a strong ethical and moral vision behind the paper that one sees and one sees in Eric generally. But beyond this, the moral equality of the originary scene, I want to push a bit further about the source of its ethics, besides a certain kind of unformalizability or undecidability of, prescriptive ethics. Is there any tension between a vision which lauds equity via Pinker and postulates the human community as its primal form, and another ethical vision which also gets raised in the paper, which is, and I'll quote, "The advancement of society demands that these talents be maximally put to use at the risk of losing out to other social groups that use their talents more efficiently." This seems, in some ways, a more Darwinian vision of ethics. And if this is the case, how does one reconcile it with this other notion of equity? And if so, if this is in some ways, and this is a discussion Eric and I have been having for years, can survival, in a sense, be a truly ethical vision or the task of ethics? Obviously, one needs to survive in order to be ethical, but whether survival itself and competition between groups is sufficient as an ethic, well, maybe it's not. I may be misunderstanding the paper here. But what kind of vision is being presented in this notion of a survival between social groups? Is this something that's about next door, the football team down the road, or is this a nation state issue, or is this I'm not sure. Finally, Gans argues that, quote, woke ideas have spread without resistance among those most severely criticised by them, including virtually all our tech billionaires, demonstrates that wokeness reflects, above all, the anxieties generated by the increasingly competitive global economy among both insecure beginners and successful performers impatient to signal their virtue. And there is no point, I don't think, in gainsaying that woke madness is a clear and present danger, a kind of resentful high-mindedness at large on that psychopath known as Twitter, or that people wield moral turns to intimidate and belittle, and that resentment of talent and wealth, of defeat generally, is true and captures, I think, a real social and cultural dynamic. But I'd also wonder whether what we call wokeness, whether this is all that ever is. After all, a parallel critique was made by Nietzsche in the genealogy of morals. And I wonder whether we might be willing to tease apart the argument by putting another placeholder here in Professor Gans's claim instead of woke. What other idea, quote, spread without resistance among those most severely criticised by them? And here a few answers might spring to mind. One would be Judaism. Another might be Christianity. A third might be philosophy itself, one of the West's longest exercises in using a discipline to try to murder itself. Philosophers take as their highest goal the ending of philosophy. And yet, like Antius, get stronger, all of these things, by merely being thrown to the ground. Wokeness, in some ways, despite its dangers, may not, in fact, be the West on its knees, but simply a perverse, sometimes crippling moral imperative, the basis of which the West has had as its foundation, Athens and Jerusalem, since the beginning, this ongoing process of order critique, which were the West to lose that moral imperative of order critique, would in fact lose itself. So I think that's my 5 minutes. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Professor Gans, can you respond?
Well, I'm thankful for Chris's. It's strange that, you know, when I kept on view a speaker, I never come up as speaker. I guess that's true of everybody. I see you as speaker and Chris as speaker, but I just see myself in this little box. Well,
I see you large as speaker.
Oh, it's only the speaker. Well, in other words, it's enforced modesty. That's interesting. well, I mean, in some ways, Chris's remarks, have to do with GA in general, or at least my vision of GA in general, and they aren't specifically focused on this. I mean, the question of ecology and of being citizens of the planet, so to speak. That's the first part of your objection, if I can even call it an objection, your emendation. Well, I mean, it's in a way that's not. It's sort of off the topic of this conference, but I think along the pinker line, which you could call it sort of Pollyannic, but it's not false. As society has evolved, and even since we discovered these questions of global warming, there's been lots of progress made in the direction of lowering pollution and lowering emissions and so on. So I would assume that, in any case, the only way to solve the problem is through human means. And so you have a kind of radicalism where people will tell you, well, we should stop having children, for instance. That's I remember, this is an old one, it goes back to, I don't know, the 60s even. People were saying, oh, I still remember some young girl who was a daughter of a former colleague who, the idea of having children was something she considered, the equivalent of, like an Orthodox Jew eating ham. But the result is actually that in all advanced countries, they don't reproduce themselves, which is part of the problem that we're having of, of immigration and integration of large numbers of Muslims, that kind of thing. I mean, that's all part of the Western malaise, but which leads me to, I guess one could go on with this, but that leads me to a second point. I just managed to lose the screen here. Yeah, sorry, playing around too much. It's my wife's computer. I'm not altogether used to it. It's much nicer than mine, so it's good to do this. So, in other words, the question of the human race in Gaia has not been resolved, but I would nor even the possibility of an asteroid hitting us. I just watched a movie about this the other day. In fact, it's like Melancholia, and it's always a kind of a human nightmare that the world is going to end, but on the beach, But let's just say that global warming so far has not led to anything really disastrous, and maybe some fires in Australia, certainly, but a lot of this can be done by focusing, say, in California, by focusing on managing the forest rather than letting all kinds of debris accumulate until there's some huge fire. And in many parts of the world, in fact, raising temperatures is not bad. So, I think that this is a problem that humans can solve within their own self-interested capacity. It doesn't require a great deal of sacrifice. By the way, I'm a dedicated recycler, in case you want to know. I think I'm the only person in my building who religiously takes out recycling every week. I don't know how many other people do that, but we can. That's something I think we can live with. It hasn't reached the point of being cataclysmic, although it's definitely a part of human life. If we think of ourselves as citizens of the world, at the very least, we have to be able to survive in it. But we should consider the other species and our own and our environment as something that we have to take care of. To what extent that means that we have to give up eating meat. Well, I don't think we can make decisions about that in any immediate way. But it may come to pass that in 100 years, people will consider eating a steak some sort of, like the equivalent of killing your pet dog. It's hard to say. These are things that I'm not wise enough to be able to predict. The more important question, I think, is the second one, which deals more with the question of the battle among societies or between societies. Well, obviously, if there were only one human society, then it would be, it's not clear what would drive that society to improve, although I'm sure it would simply on the basis of the human imagination, it would invent new tools and so on. But the idea of competition, as we all know from Adam Smith, has brought about a great deal of improvement simply because it's you have a real motivation, and the market provides this motivation. Unfortunately, although the economic market provides it so nicely that it even works in China. In other words, that there's not an incompatibility between a communist totalitarian state and relative success on the market, which is something that you would never have guessed in the days of the USSR. There is nonetheless a problem in the more political world where you have bombs and things like that. And so the idea of the one world is a kind of a utopia. There's something that developed back in the days of, Thomas More, but let's just say that the League of Nations might be the best way of starting this. The idea that we can somehow all come together and create a kind of, League of Nations, which was then repeated in the UN. And, with generally very unsatisfactory results, but it seems like something that we have to keep working on. And hopefully, let's just put it this way, if we don't have some kind of League of Nations, United Nations organization that can stop World War III, we're not too far from it. If you've been following the news, China has been making some very belligerent statements about their place in the world, and the threat to Taiwan is no small matter. And if that goes through, we're going to be in real trouble. So, if China decides that they can take over Taiwan, and then, either we respond and they may have a nuclear holocaust, or we don't respond, and all of a sudden, we become the equivalent of Europe under Hitler. It's not going to be simple. Let's hope that this will not, end that way. But it obviously shows the need for a kind of international world. We thought that bringing China into the WTO would make things much better, and in many ways it did, but we didn't realize that you could go from Deng to Xi in a couple of generations. And so the question is, how does one deal with this? So far, we haven't found a way, because precisely these human groups are in conflict, and you can't, there's no body above them. Maybe in the days of the Korean War, we thought that, the United Nations could declare war on Korea, but even that didn't work out. If you recall, that was the first big war we didn't win. Today, it's rather obvious that the United Nations isn't going to prevent anything because it's such a corrupt organization. And yet we can't help trying to go back, if you like, to the originary scene, and where we were all just one community. I mean, the reason there's this conflict between ethics and morality is that morality represents the ideal, the human. I mean, I have a great deal of sympathy for wokeness, at least in its basic sense, which is, let's all be equal. Let's avoid any kind of distinctions, because we're all morally equivalent. But once you say that, and then there's this question of firstness. I like that term because it's sort of my own term, reinvented from first, also through Adam Katz and so on. But the idea of firstness, and I could even say this speaking as a member of the Jewish faith or religion, the Jews, why are the Jews the one people who are hated by, for decades? They even have their own word, anti-Semitism. But, why is that true of the Jews and not of any other people on the face of the earth? Well, I think it's because in the Judeo-Christian world, in the Western world, which is the dominant, or has been the dominant world for a good deal of, of all of modern period, the Jews were there first. And it's as simple as that. Although, Adam Katz and I wrote a book a few years ago, a book of essays, but still we published this book with ISGAP, which is supposed to be a society for the study of anti-Semitism, and they published it, but they never gave it any publicity. And the book has received absolutely no attention. And the reason was because it's just so simple that the people who specialize in anti-Semitism can't bear to think of it that way. They have to think about, people are crazy. Speaking of it as a disease. But in any case, firstness is precisely the fact that, you don't like it when the other guy does something better than you. And that's why some years ago, I even wrote a paper, which was my only contribution to political science. It was published in a political science journal called The Critique of Pure Fairness, in which I suggested the model of a society where everything is meritocratic. That would be the worst society for people to live in. It's much better than a caste society where you can say, I'm just as smart as the Brahmin, but I'm only an untouchable, so, that's just the way it is. Or I'm just a peasant and he's the king, so, But if you have to say, I got a 10 on the exam and he got a 90, well, there isn't any way that you can face up to that without losing face to yourself, and it contradicts your sense of moral equality, because you're saying, well, I'm just as good as you are. How come I got a lower grade? And it's interesting how this is being borne out. I think that's really the tension and the pain, if you like, in the whole woke phenomenon. It's because, and the reason the woke phenomenon is essentially among whites and essentially among privileged or quasi-privileged whites. It's not something that was invented by BLM. It's something that Black resentment is something that's essentially being exploited to allow you to say that, the society is so racist. That means that if I got a lower grade than he did, even if I'm white, I'm still suffering in this society, which is unequal. And so that success in this society, in other words, is not worth anything. It's, demeaned. Whereas in China, as I understand it, I don't say I understand China that well, China has an age-old tradition of examinations and Mandarinate and so on. And so, China lends itself much more readily to a meritocracy. And that's one of the reasons why people who are from the Chinese ambience, if you like, which includes many Asians, do so well in school, while all the Jewish kids who went to the Bronx High School of Science have largely been, in my day, it was like 85% or 90% Jewish. Well, today, there's something like 65, if I understand correctly, like 65% Asian, because the Asian families, they get their kids to learn the same way the Jewish families did when I was a kid. And so these things make modern society very, problematic, and in ways in which even outside of international conflicts, they lead to tensions. But I think especially dangerous in a time when, you see the Chinese have this nationalism based on not only the age-old tradition, but the fact that they were humiliated by the West. They consider themselves, the Middle Kingdom as, the whole world. It's such a large society. It's like, it's old and, in many ways the oldest of our civilizations, and it has all these great achievements, including, gunpowder and paper and so on. So the humiliation of China, which, the first version of this, of course, was Japan and the Meiji era in the 19th century, but Japan being smaller was able to kind of jump on this faster. But today, China has gotten into this, well, so they don't have any nationalistic problems. And the fact that they are, certainly racist, if you want to talk about racism, doesn't bother them because, so in any way, I'm sort of getting away from them. But the key problem of different societies is obviously one that I think much more urgent than the problem of the environment, of ecology. But there isn't any simple way of dealing with it. Not that long ago, and in my own lifetime, they were killing people, aside from the Holocaust, which was the most horrible sort of example of it. I mean, just World War II in general. We all remember Hiroshima, but then there was Dresden, and there was bombing in all kinds of places. The fact is that there was no hesitation to kill civilians in huge numbers. And we wouldn't have won the war if that hadn't been the case. I mean, I think Truman was probably right to drop the bomb and all that. But, whatever you think about it, this is not that long ago. This is in my own lifetime, or the lifetime of your parents, if you will. So human beings, in other words, they're not, necessarily good and happy. But, as even if Pinker can point out that even with all the deaths in World War II, that it's, humans have still statistically lived much better in the 20th century than they did in the 19th and so on. So these are questions that I would hope that GA and AI can help to solve, but I don't think, it would be foolhardy of me to suggest that I have a solution to this. As I said, human firstness has always been in conflict with morality, and one tries to minimize that conflict, but obviously one can't simply eliminate it. And I think it would be, I mean, let's just say that a theory can't predict history. If anything, the theory that Generative Anthropology tells you why we can't predict things. I mean, you're always creating new degrees of freedom, and so you can't master the thing. That's why we tend to be favorable toward things like the market. But I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. Chris, do you have a response? Are we getting a few questions in the chat line that I'll articulate in a few moments? But Chris, did you want to come back on that at all?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Eric. And this is as you know, this is a conversation we've been having for years. I guess I just want just a couple of questions there, because my understanding of Smith is that it's not the communal competition, the invisible hand works on our own self-interest that doesn't function at the level of what we might call kin selection. But it's about it's private interests that motivate us, and not something that we bound in community. Of course, the question of firstness is an interesting one.
Mandeville, you know.
Yeah, right. So this is the other thing about the question of firstness, I guess, is I'm wondering, and this, if we push it in a certain way, whether it drags you into an area which would be slightly odder, and that is about the kind of resentments that people have towards First Nations people, which of course Indigenous people were first in some, direct sense, and whether any of that gets channeled there, whether firstness, one of the manifestations of the resentment towards firstness, it could be, behind some of the kind of antipathy that is often present towards Indigenous peoples. But one of the things, I guess, about firstness is the act of a claim of coming first, is that in most cases of cultural change, of evolution, first is a difficult thing to kind of make a claim about. Even in the case of Judaic firstness, it only emerges as a kind of absolute if you sideline Canaanite religions, Babylonian religions, and then monotheistic varieties. And even within Judaism itself doesn't have an absolute beginning, because the God of the Israelites isn't a unity. The Yahweh of J is not the same Yahweh as the Elohist or the Deuteronomist or the priestly writer. And I mean, Harold Bloom spent a whole career talking, and maybe too much of his corpuses, to show the internal complexities. And I don't think it's merely academic, because most of the things we think about of firstness, of absolute beginnings, it's a complex instance, and a complex series of questions where our temporal sense can be easily upset that most of the things that arrive to us from this, this is a newish watch. I don't want to advertise it. We're not product placement here, but, like the mechanism in there, what makes this new? Well, the mechanisms are really an 18th century mechanism. The goldish finishes on it is a much more mid-20th century. The emergence of this thing, at one level you'd say it's new, but another level it's a museum of technology. And I think most culture works like this. So unless one way of qualifying what you might be saying is saying, well, claims about firstness are what upsets, and not firstness itself. And again, I know there's differences between you and Adam in this idea. Anyway, I don't want to, there's so much, and I'd love to continue this later, obviously, with me and Dennis and anyone who wants to join in. But just a couple of things about that. What do you think?
Are you asking me about that? Well, first, I mean, I don't want to make a thing about the Jews. God, you understand why everyone hates the Jews, because they think they're the chosen people and so on. But the fact is that everybody else thinks they're the chosen people too. Otherwise, they wouldn't hate them. I mean, why did Hitler think that his mission on Earth was to get rid of the Jews? It's not something anyone's ever had about it. Even people who massacre, Indians or whatever, or I mean, Indians in the sense of Native Americans. I mean, they didn't have the sense that this was their mission. They're just sort of trying to get rid of them. So. But firstness does have its own basis, but it's also magnified, because after what I really wanted to say about firstness, and I never quite got to, is that the way to look at firstness, and I think this is true of the Jews as well as everyone else, the Jews aren't, it's not that the Jews are better than others or whatever. The point is that we discovered a certain conception of God. However, don't say we discovered it out of nothing, but in any case, the Jewish conception of God, which was sent around the world by Christianity, it's obviously, you talk about a Jew today, and, it's very significant that I, as a Jew, was a student of René Girard. It's not the other way around. In other words, I learned from a Christian. I mean, all Jews today are essentially, children of Christians because we have lived in a Christian world. It's the Western world is a Christian world, not a Jewish world. But and only at a certain point were Jews allowed to participate in this world, and we flourished in a Christian world or under a Christian aegis. But firstness, in other words, is a gift. The point is that we gave the world this conception of God. Christianity gave the world this conception of Jesus and so on. The firstness is supposed to be a gift. That's why I, in a recent Chronicle, I mentioned the fact that, when the Pope is washing the feet of the poor on Thursday, I think. Well, the idea is that he's not showing himself to be inferior to them, unlike the people who are bowing down to Black Lives Matter and so on. He was, the Pope is showing that from the level of his wealth and strength and power, that he is willing to give this gift to the poor by washing their feet. In other words, he's not morally better than they are, but since he's he has more capacity to act than they do, he is gifting them with this. And that is how we should always look at firstness. That's how you'll tend to look at it, say, in an athletic contest. When somebody wins, maybe the guy who loses is unhappy, but the spectators enjoy that victory because they see it as a gift of, superior human performance. Unfortunately, that tends to work only in sports, but I think sports, are very relevant here. So the basic idea of firstness, in other words, is that you can contribute more to society, and that even, however obscene it is for some billionaire to have, be worth $100 billion, you could say that, well, Amazon is contributing to the society by, improving the quality of marketing. So although the original Mandeville-Smith idea of the market it's entirely selfish, but it's not, it's not really entirely selfish. It's a coordination of my self-interest with that of the society, and which also includes if I become really rich, then I'm sort of expected to create a foundation and give money to charity and so on. So in other words, we should use all talents. That's the thing. And the problem of today's society, I think, is not so much a racial one, as the sense that people are no longer, they no longer have this great American sense, which is also Australian, that you can kind of do anything. A lot of people have been, put in a position where they resent others because they feel that somehow the others are more privileged than they are. And I think the professional whites tend to take it out on the on whites in general, which basically means people in flyover country like Missouri, from which I'm speaking. If you look at the white people out here, these are not people in Los Angeles, and they're not, and these are not people who are interested in being woke and so on. And you can understand that. So I think the basic restoration of this sense of duty, the sense that, I'm rich and my duty is to help others with my wealth, I think is something that is definitely not lost, but it's been distorted by all these kind of political maneuvers, and especially by, and I think the worst thing, I'm sure Chris would agree, is promoting resentment. In other words, this thing like Black Lives Matter, is one thing to say that Black Lives Matter, of course they do, but it's another thing to use this as a kind of weapon against whites. This is very far from Martin Luther King's idea, and I think that was, that was something that needs to be restored. Because most Black people don't have this kind of resentment, I can tell you, in everyday life. But that resentment is played up so much. And I think the reason is that people are, in a competitive society, and they tend to need to have other resentments to point to. And but let's hope we can get beyond that. But I think, I'm not sure AI can help us that much, but I think at least that points to a direction we have to go in, just as physical handicaps have to be met with, sympathy and so on. Mental handicaps are the worst, because you really can't be a lawyer or a doctor if you don't have a certain level of mental agility. And this is not something to do with your racial background. It has a lot to do with your upbringing. And so some kind of a improved use of artificial intelligence to improve human intelligence at a very early age would be very, very useful, as opposed to teaching kids critical race theory in kindergarten, which is they're trying to do now.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that there have been some questions in the chat field, and I think it'll be my job now to try and read some of these out and see if we got some responses from Eric. As I was saying at the beginning of the session, there is time, I think a little bit time, if for those who want to take it, to go to the extra room, the networking room 1 after. So we've got about 10 minutes left at this point, but we could do a little bit of that after for anyone who's interested. Now, I've got a question from Andrew, and I'm guessing that's Andrew McKenna, although there wasn't a surname, because he talks about himself as an originary disciple of GA. He writes, the soul, I circled 3 among still other mentions. I don't recall as an originary disciple of GA its mention. I don't at all ask for a metaphysical or theological or otherwise transcendental discussion, but a distinctly GA consideration of what is, for many, what a soul, I guess, is for many, remains an elusive abstraction or a mystification. So do you have something to say about the soul, Eric?
I'm very glad that this came up, because yeah, I mean, if people read my 700-odd Chronicles, that they will notice that there's been a certain evolution. That's one of the reasons why I haven't been so anxious to write books recently. I find that Chronicles are a better way of, throwing out new ideas. But yes, it's partly because of Bishop Wallon, who appeared in our meeting this year, and who had written to me some time earlier, who is an Anglican bishop, but just in general, maybe getting old. It's not that I, become a believer, but I've tried to narrow throughout. One of the points I made early in GA was to try to narrow the distinction between man created God and God created man. But taking it more seriously, you have to think of what it is those two things have in common. And of course, they have this notion of a God, but, is God our invention, or is he? Well, so I thought of the soul as one way of putting it, the human self, but the human self, which is not just a self, which is not self-contained, because it's also connected to the human community. I think that's the thing about that's the thing that GA should be able to develop as the basis of its anthropology. In other words, whatever you think about the sacred, I tried to think, what is it that we call the sacred? Girard talks about the sacred as the violence and so on, violence or the sacred. But what is it about that central object that you consider sacred? And then I realized that there's a sense in you of a will that interdicts it. As in my originary scene hypothesis, I was saying that these guys are standing around, and probably no women there, but you never know. But in any case, these guys are standing around this thing, and they've had many experiences where the old alpha beta system has no longer worked, and so now they're all kind of terrified. And you can say it's like trying to, not taking the last piece of cake, but it's obviously stronger than that. But you don't want to reduce it to pure animal fear. There's a sense that there's some force pulling you back, and that force is protecting you at the same time as it's denying your desire. And if you like, when you get to the point where you're using the gesture as no longer an aborted gesture, but as a sign to others that this is the center, this is the thing that we all desire, and at the same time cannot have, and thereby the sacred becomes the basis of the significant. I think that clarifies a lot of the, I think it's an improvement over my earlier formulation. Don't forget, I began by trying to discover the origin of language. And in fact, in 1981, I used Girard's scapegoating scene as the basis, because all I needed was a bunch of guys standing around something. But obviously, I've improved it since. I think that this is very important, that the idea of the sacred as being beyond belief. It's not just a matter of whether I believe in God or not, but because what links me and you and all of us is the fact that we all belong to the same culture, which in a way includes different culture levels like societies, but ultimately we're all human. And, so it's that aspect which I think allows us to talk about a soul and a conscience, which is not necessarily mediated by God, but which is certainly mediated by a force that transcends our individual existence toward a collective existence, toward the community, which is something that animals only have in instinctive terms. Like insects, they have different kind of pheromones or whatever that they communicate with, but humans communicate culturally through the scene of representation. In other words, through their minds, and they are free, as Sartre would put it.
Thank you. Okay, that's a great answer. I've got a question that is trying to go back to the originary scene and ask for some clarification from Woody Belanger. And I read, a child wants an object out of reach and so sticks out her hand as far as she is able toward the object. A parent, seeing what is happening, hands the object to the child. The child, already used to the notion of reaching for an object as a way of grabbing it, now has learned that this reaching, pointing, signals the object to the parent. Why isn't this sort of everyday interaction sufficient to establish the ostensive gesture? Isn't acquisition and not deferral of violence a more parsimonious explanation of ostensive signaling?
Well, I think the answer is simply prima facie that, all right, why not? The fact is that, a cat can reach for something and have the mother cat give it to her, and the dog can do the same thing, or maybe even an insect. But that's not what happened. One thing that's been shown by the cognitive scientists is that the joint shared attention is a purely human phenomenon. Even chimpanzees don't do this. They can point to things, but they don't point to things in that kind of shared attention mode. In other words, it's a three-part mode. It's a Girardian triangle. I point to it, but you have to look at the thing and not my finger, as the Zen people will tell you. You have to know that I'm pointing it, not just out of desire to point, but the desire to show it to you. And that's what, but animals don't do that, apparently. You would think they would, but they don't. So the question is turned around the other way. Why is it, why isn't it? Well, because there's something much more difficult about that than you think by simply, presenting it in this way. And that you're not learning from children. Children are learning from you. If it weren't for your culture and for human culture in general, children wouldn't be able to learn it themselves, as we've seen.
Okay, thank you. I had a question from Matthew Taylor, who was pulling back from it, but I was interested in the same question, so we're going to ask it anyway, Matthew. The question you mentioned of neural implants for underperforming kids, or maybe we could put the question just this way. Could you expand a little bit on the idea of that first project for AI in a practical context? How indeed could AI be used to help educational attainment become more egalitarian, as I believe was the point there.
Well, there I have to admit that I'm not, and I think you could tell from my talk, I don't want to pretend that I'm some kind of an expert in AI techniques. My great achievements in computer activity were like writing programs to play, solitaire or something. I've never really learned to deal with the AI level of computer programming. So I didn't want to get involved in any technical type of discussion. But I know that obviously this would require a great deal of research into what it is in a child's mind that is built up through the kind of, why the Chinese kids do better than black kids in school, what is it that the Chinese kids are getting that the black kids aren't, and try to find something really basic in that, even, beneath the cultural, because, it's you can't train the parents to act similarly, but you can have some. This would require a lot of research to try to understand, but basically you're creating synapses and reactions. And, the fact is that kids do play video games, and to some extent, I think that improves their intelligence. But, video games are obviously not designed for, any more than entertainment. But, I have a feeling that this whole online teaching, which benefited in some ways from the COVID epidemic, has a long way to go before it actually provides real benefits. But I think that would be a definite area of research that, with cognitive, all these cognitive theorists should be able to think about what it is in the mind that allows children to develop in the direction of being able at a later date to work with mathematics and also with language. Lawyers don't have to do math, but they have to know how to use a very elaborate vocabulary system and so on. And, it's not something that you can acquire just by taking a course. But that's, a cop-out, but I really think that, that's what's a project. It's not as though if I really knew more clearly, I would, I think this is something for the AI, but it's a goal that I think that AI can take on, and that would certainly, they'd certainly get funds for it if they could show any results. And I think it would do a lot to break down this kind of caste barrier between, let's say, children of single mothers and so on, and the sort of children that you have in the suburbs, or, children. Another thing about kids when I was little is that we were much less, as the French say, chouchouté. When I was a kid, I remember taking the subway at the age of around 10. Today, I noticed that in the years that I've lived in Santa Monica, I've never seen a young person in the street alone. You never see a kid below 12, even 14, walking by himself or herself. Unless they just came out of school, but either there's just no sense in which kids can do anything independently of parents. And this is something that, obviously means that they're sort of hothouse kids, but I think we have to try to improve their intellectual capacities, regardless of whether they're streetwise.
Okay, we're almost out of time, I think, until we migrate perhaps to the networking room number 1. But I do have one question. Questioner Oliver, who is interested in getting clarity about the distinction. I would interpreting this question as the distinction between the moral and the ethical on the originary scene and so forth. So his question finally is, the question is, what is moral equality and how is it related to social performance?
Well, I think that the simplest way is to talk about it in terms of the scene, but you can also use something like the golden rule. It's a matter of symmetry, do unto others. But in other words, the originary scene gives you a sense of all these people who could be violent, but they learn to control their impulses, and at the end they divide up the the meat, and they celebrate it as a ceremony. And as I say, this is something that we do every day, or at least this is a human behavior for the throughout the ages. Sharing food is always the most the typical way humans get together, right? I mean, even having a drink, but it's that sense of symmetry that comes from being in this kind of symmetrical situation. And we reproduce this in churches and so on, and all singing together. And so you have, so that's where you recognize moral equality, but also in situations where there isn't any kind of social structure, like if you're in the lifeboat and you want to decide which one has to be eaten by the others, or which one has to jump over the side because the lifeboat is filling up with water. You draw straws. You don't say, well, I'm smarter than you, so you can jump on me. There's a sense in which we all recognize this sort of basic human moral equality. Now, the whole question of ethics, I think, is linked to the fact that human societies began as essentially equal societies. There weren't any social distinctions. The so-called hunter-gatherer societies don't make distinctions of hierarchy or caste. Obviously, some are smarter and stronger, but they all have the same level. And as I recall from my small amount of study in this area, when they divide up food, they tend to divide it up very evenly, and nobody's supposed to take more than anyone else. In other words, there's a sense of equal parts. But when you reach a certain level, and in particular the Neolithic and the level of agriculture, and people start accumulating goods, and that's the way you have this, as Rousseau puts it, ceci qui le premier dit, ceci est à moi. In other words, when you have agriculture, you have one guy who says, okay, this is my field, and I'm going to enclose this field, and I'll just keep all the food, and my field is bigger than your field. Well, that's just too bad. And so hierarchical society depends on the so-called surplus. And once you have that, you have all the, horrors of kind of ethical distinction, the distinction between ethics and morality, including the most, extreme distinctions, like the emperor can do anything he wants to anyone else, or the pharaoh can have thousands of slaves working in his field, and that kind of thing. So, not to speak of the Aztecs, and you all know about the Aztecs, right? It's been pretty much shown that the reason that they killed all those prisoners is that they didn't have any other large sources of protein. At least I think that's a fairly generally accepted. So ethics, in other words, comes in within the equalitarian system. The ethical, nevertheless, doesn't go away. In other words, the sense that this guy got more than I did doesn't go away. And I think the fact that anthropologists have shown that these societies are not peaceful, they tend to have a lot of murders, and then if somebody dies, somebody gets blamed for it. In other words, they tend to be more violent than hierarchical societies, because just making everyone morally equal doesn't really solve the problem. Everybody has some sense of, why did he get more than I did? Or why is he taller than I am? Or why is she prettier than I am? Those are all questions that, so anyway, I mean, the history of the world. But
oh, thank you very much for that, and the other answers and the talk itself. I'm going to invite everyone to thank our plenary speaker, Eric Gans, and invite anyone who's interested to join us. I believe we need to go back to the agenda, I guess, and to join the networking room #1, and hopefully some of you will want to do that.
Leave on this thing that I will wind up in, I can then go back to the room.
Yeah, to networking room #1. I believe one does that through the general agenda. I don't think you can get there directly from here.
Well, I have to leave this. Well, thanks very much for your attention. I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome, but it's been a pleasure to have this discussion. I wish you were all here in person, but you know, I'm very glad that I got to do this. As I say, I think you know, Rene has some connections up there, and so he created the storm, so I would have to postpone my departure. We'll give him some credit for this. And it's very nice talking to you, Chris. I hope I get to see some more echidnas, and, you know, I'm a big fan of Australian literature, as you know.
Thanks so
much. Thank you again.